You're under oath to protect the American people. Those words should mean something when you're standing on the House floor asking for a vote. But what you're about to hear is a congressman wrapping a funding battle in the flag of national security while 6 Americans lie dead from a military operation he's using as political cover. This isn't a normal appropriations debate. It's a masterclass in how crisis becomes currency. Representative Green just spent 20 minutes connecting dots that don't connect. Iranian aggression from 1979, fentanyl deaths, Chicago murder rates, and a shutdown his own party controls, all threaded together to make one thing sound like another. He calls it a Democrat shutdown of Homeland Security. But here's what he doesn't say. Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. They passed a bill that excluded DHS funding, and now they're blaming the minority for not rescuing them from their own strategy. The tell is in the timing. Operation Epic Fury, Trump's strike on Iran, happened days ago. 6 service members died. And today, instead of briefing the intelligence committees or demanding accountability for how that operation was planned, Green is on the floor turning their deaths into a rhetorical weapon to pass a funding bill. He's not mourning, he's lobbying. That's not leadership, that's exploitation. What comes next matters, because if this works, if fear of being called weak on defense forces a vote, it won't be the last time grief gets weaponized for a budget win.
Legislation forward that provides full funding for the personnel, training, and technology necessary to protect our homeland and keep our communities safe, secure, and resilient. The Department of Homeland Security oversees agencies responsible for aviation security, border protection, cyber defense, disaster response, maritime security, and counterterrorism missions that directly impact the safety of millions of Americans every single day. Simply put, a yes vote on today's rule is a vote to consider legislation that will fully fund the Department of Homeland Security, ensuring that the agencies tasked with keeping the American people safe, from counterterrorism to cybersecurity to disaster response, are not weakened at a moment when threats are rapidly increasing. A yes vote on today's rule is a vote to stand with the men and women on the front lines of our national security, from Coast Guardsmen to TSA officers to cyber defenders, law enforcement personnel, and emergency responders who are now working every day without pay to keep our country safe. And a yes vote on today's rule is a vote to consider legislation to end this Democrat shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security and restore the resources necessary to defend the American people. Mr. Speaker, the need to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security becomes even clearer when we consider the serious global threats facing our country today. For nearly 50 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, has called our country the Great Satan and indoctrinated generations of its people with a chance of death to America, making clear it's a commitment to our destruction. And despite repeated attempts at diplomacy, the regime has relentlessly pursued a nuclear weapon, developed its ballistic missile program, and funded proxy terrorist organizations across the world, all while its own people suffer under corruption, repression, and economic collapse. This past Saturday, President Donald J. Trump kept his promise, decisively authorizing Operation Epic Fury, a large-scale kinetic military operation targeting key regime military infrastructure and leadership responsible for incessant aggression and attacks against the United States and our allies. This moment did not occur in isolation. It was the result of decades of sustained hostility by the Iranian regime toward the United States, just as the maniacal Iranian regime was reaching the nuclear weapon threshold. To the American people, the timeline is clear. In November 1979, Iranian students backed by the regime stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held hostage 66 brave Americans for 444 days as they beat them and subjected them to mock executions and other forms of torture. In October 1983, Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, killed 241 American military service members, including 220 Marines and 21 other service personnel, in a truck bombing at a Marine compound in Beirut. In June 1996, Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorists killed 19 U.S. airmen and wounded nearly 500 others in a truck bombing at a U.S. Air Force housing complex in Saudi Arabia. Between 2003 and 2011, Iranian proxies killed at least 603 American troops in Iraq, roughly 1 out of every 6 American combat deaths in that war. In January 2016, Iranian forces seized 2 U.S. Navy boats and detained 10 U.S. sailors who were held at gunpoint, forced to kneel with their hands behind their heads and filmed for propaganda being released 15 hours later. More recently, on October 7, 2023, Iran-backed Hamas terrorists murdered 46 Americans and kidnapped 12 Americans in addition. Between October 2023 and November 2024, Iran and its proxies carried out more than 180 attacks on U.S. forces in the region, killing American service members and wounding American service personnel. In July 2024, an Iranian national linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps attempted to assassinate then-candidate for president Donald J. Trump, forcing his presidential campaign, which I remember being a part of it, to charter decoy planes to evade the threat. And in recent weeks, Iranian representatives continued to lie and negotiate in bad faith, stalling peace talks as they prepared offensive military threats against American forces. This pattern of aggression makes crystal clear that these are not isolated incidents. They instead represent a sustained and deliberate campaign by the Iranian regime to target the United States and undermine our national security. This is precisely why decisive action by our Commander-in-Chief, President Donald J. Trump, was necessary. By destroying Iran's military capabilities, its missile capabilities, dismantling its naval strength, and ensuring that this regime can never obtain a nuclear weapon, President Trump and his administration have acted to protect the American people and defend our national interests. This level of action is only possible because of the strength of the United States military. During his first term, President Donald J. Trump rebuilt our military to a level many thought would never be possible. Through historic investments, a renewed focus on modernization, and the restoration of military readiness, he ensured that today we possess the strongest and most capable military humanity has ever seen. And it is that peace through strength, rebuilt and restored, that made decisive operations like Operation Epic Fury possible, demonstrating to our adversaries that the United States has both the capability and the resolve to act swiftly, effectively, and without hesitation to protect the citizens of our country. Mr. Speaker, during this operation, 6 Americans bravely sacrificed their lives to keep our homeland safe, and may we forever remember and honor their legacy of selfless service to these United States of America. But the threats facing our country today do not stop at distant battlefields. They can reach our networks, our borders, and our communities here at home. While Iran's aggression is often discussed in terms of conflict in the Middle East, we must not forget that the regime and its proxies also pose a direct threat to the American homeland. Our Homeland Security and intelligence agencies have warned that Iran and its affiliates maintain the capability to conduct cyber attacks against our utility services, direct espionage campaigns within our borders, and potentially inspire or direct violence within the United States, targeting critical infrastructure, financial systems, and other essential networks on which millions of Americans rely. That is why President Trump's Department of Homeland Security plays such a vital role in coordinating intelligence, strengthening cyber defenses, securing transportation systems, and protecting the American homeland from emerging threats. Mr. Speaker, border security is homeland security. At a time when hostile regimes and terrorist networks continue to threaten the United States, we cannot ignore the risks posed by an unsecure border and inadequate vetting of individuals entering our country. Ensuring that terrorists, traffickers, and foreign operatives cannot exploit weakness in our immigration system is a fundamental responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security. While security at our southern border has drastically improved and more than 600,000 criminal aliens have been deported under President Trump's administration, millions of unvetted illegal immigrants who entered our country during 4 years of the porous open border under Biden administration still remain in the United States today. Among these illegal immigrants are members of violent transnational gangs, some of which have ties to Iranian-backed terror networks who threaten the safety of American communities. At a time of heightened global tensions and increasing threats, the presence of even one dangerous individual.
What Representative Green did on that House floor wasn't just a speech about funding. It was a structural test of whether fear can substitute for accountability. And if you understand how he built that argument, you'll see a pattern that shows up everywhere power tries to dodge scrutiny by wrapping itself in security. Start with the framing. Green opens by calling this a Democrat shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. That language does heavy lifting. A shutdown implies obstruction, refusal, sabotage. But here's the mechanics. Republicans control the House, Senate, and White House. They wrote the original funding bill that excluded DHS. They chose a piecemeal strategy. And when Democrats refused to go along with conditions attached to that strategy, Green rebranded their opposition as a shutdown. That's not description, that's accusation dressed up as fact. Now layer in the Iran narrative. Green spends a third of his speech recounting Iranian aggression spanning 45 years, from the 1979 hostage crisis to recent attacks on U.S. forces. He ties that history directly to Operation Epic Fury, Trump's recent military strike, and the deaths of 6 Americans. Then he pivots. Because Iran is a threat, because our troops are in harm's way, because terror networks exist, we must fund DHS immediately. The logical chain sounds tight until you ask one question. What does any of that have to do with why DHS funding was excluded in the first place? The answer is nothing, but the emotional weight makes it feel connected. This is threat conflation. You take a real danger, Iranian proxies, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, fentanyl trafficking, and you place it next to a procedural dispute about appropriations. The proximity does the work. Suddenly, anyone who votes no isn't just disagreeing on budget tactics. They're weakening cybersecurity. They're leaving Coast Guard families unpaid. They're abandoning TSA officers. Green lists those consequences one by one, and each one is real. But none of them explain why his party structured the bill this way to begin with. Then there's the rhetorical use of the 6 Americans killed in Operation Epic Fury. Green invokes their sacrifice, honors their legacy, and immediately follows with warnings about homeland threats. It's a move that makes questioning the bill feel like dishonoring the dead. That's not argument. That's emotional barrier construction. If you want to know whether a funding decision makes sense, the deaths of service members in a separate military operation shouldn't be the reason you're afraid to ask hard questions. What's missing from Green's speech is any explanation of what happened in the negotiation. Why was DHS excluded from the original bill? What were the terms Democrats rejected? What specific oversight provisions or policy riders were attached? He doesn't say. Instead, he lists threats, cites crime statistics under Trump, praises military strength, and demands a vote. The structure is designed to make inquiry look like weakness. The consequence isn't just this one vote, it's the normalization of crisis rhetoric as a substitute for legislative transparency. When you can invoke Iran, fentanyl, and dead soldiers to pass a budget bill without explaining the budget process, you've made accountability optional, and once that works, it works again. Next time the issue will be different, but the formula stays the same. External threat plus emotional appeal plus time pressure equals vote now, ask later. If any of this matters to you, demand the details that were left out. What were the conditions? Who walked away from what? And why are we being told that funding Homeland Security requires us to stop asking how we got here? Because the answer to that question is usually where the truth lives.